You're washing dishes, driving, or just staring out the window, and suddenly, a memory from years ago hits you like a punch in the stomach. An inexplicable sadness, a guilt that no longer makes sense, or a completely ordinary scene that carries an overwhelming emotional weight. Why would your mind do this out of nowhere? What if I told you this isn't your brain replaying the past, but your consciousness dealing with something that is happening right now, just somewhere else? Before you try to push it away, notice this for a moment. Where do you feel it in your body? Your chest, your throat, your stomach? Stay there for a few seconds. No story, just the sensation. Because what you're about to understand can completely change how you see these moments. This is not regression. It's contact. And the way you respond to it determines whether you stay stuck or finally release something that was never fully resolved. You know that horrible feeling of thinking you had already moved on from someone or healed a wound, and suddenly you wake up feeling the same pain again. The frustration hits hard. You judge yourself, thinking your spiritual growth has failed or that you've gone backwards. But what you didn't realize is that there is a hidden automatic mechanism behind this repetition that has nothing to do with regression. What makes this experience so convincing is how real it feels in your body. It's not just a thought passing through your mind. It's a full emotional return. Your chest tightens, your stomach drops, your thoughts begin to loop in a familiar pattern. It feels identical to how it once felt, maybe even stronger. And because of that intensity, your mind quickly jumps to a conclusion. I thought I was done with this, why am I back here again? But that conclusion is built on an assumption that isn't as solid as it seems. The idea that healing is a straight path, and once something is resolved, it should never show up again. That belief sets a trap, because the moment the feeling returns, you don't just feel the emotion itself. You also layer it with disappointment, self-doubt, and even shame. Now you're not only experiencing the original pain, you're also fighting yourself for having it. Pause for a second and notice what actually happens in that moment. The emotion appears first. Then comes the interpretation. The interpretation says, this shouldn't be happening. And that's where the real friction begins. There's something important to see here. The reappearance of an emotion does not automatically mean the same story is repeating in the same way. It only means that something with a similar emotional signature has surfaced in your awareness. But your mind is trained to connect that feeling to a past identity, a past situation, a past version of you. It labels it quickly. This is that old wound again. What if that label is too simplistic? Think about how memory works in your daily life. A smell can bring back a place. A song can bring back a person. But you don't assume you've gone back in time. You recognize that something in the present triggered a resonance with something stored in you. Now imagine that this process is happening at a deeper level, not just with external triggers, but from within your own field of awareness. The mistake isn't that you're feeling something again. The mistake is assuming that the feeling belongs exclusively to your past and that its return means failure. This is where many people unconsciously create a loop. They feel the emotion, they resist it, they try to push it away or fix it as quickly as possible. They might distract themselves, overanalyze it, or force themselves into a more positive state. On the surface, it seems like they're taking control, but underneath that resistance is actually reinforcing the pattern. The emotion isn't allowed to move, so it stays active, waiting for another opening. And then it returns, often stronger, more intrusive, more confusing. There's also another subtle layer that makes this trap even more convincing: identity. When the feeling comes back, it doesn't just bring emotion, it brings a version of you. The version that was hurt, rejected, uncertain, or afraid. For a moment, it feels like you've become that person again. And that's deeply unsettling because you've worked hard to grow beyond that version. But what if you're not becoming that version again, and instead you're becoming aware of it from a different position? This shift is small, but it changes everything. Instead of seeing the experience as a collapse of your progress, you can begin to see it as contact. Contact with something that is still active in a way you don't fully understand yet. And that's where the question naturally begins to change. Instead of asking, why am I back here? You start asking, what exactly is this and why does it feel like it's happening now? Because if it truly were just a replay of the past, it wouldn't carry this sense of immediacy. It wouldn't feel alive. It wouldn't interrupt your present moment with this kind of force. So maybe the problem isn't that you've gone backwards. Maybe the problem is assuming that time, and everything tied to your experience, moves in a simple, straight line. Quantum physics shows us that time is not a straight line, where the past stays dead behind you. Everything you've ever lived, and everything you could have lived in every choice you didn't make, is still vibrating in this exact millisecond. When that memory invades your mind, you didn't travel through time. In reality, two versions of reality just touched each other. This idea can feel strange at first, because your daily experience seems to confirm the opposite. You wake up, you move through your day, and it feels like one moment leads cleanly into the next. Yesterday feels behind, tomorrow feels ahead, and the present seems like a thin line in between. Your mind is trained to organize reality this way because it makes life easier to navigate. But what is practical is not always what is true. At a deeper level, time behaves less like a straight road and more like a vast field where multiple possibilities exist at once. Not as abstract theory, but as something that subtly shows up in your own experience. You felt this before, even if you didn't have words for it. Moments where something feels strangely familiar, even though it's new. Or times when a decision feels heavier than it should, as if more is at stake than what's visible. When a memory suddenly appears with emotional force, it carries that same quality. It doesn't feel like a distant archive. It feels present, active, almost as if it's happening now, just out of sight. And maybe that's exactly what it is. Instead of imagining your past as something stored and finished, consider the possibility that it still exists as a kind of active layer, not in a mystical, exaggerated way, but in a very precise sense, as unresolved patterns of experience that haven't fully settled. And more than that, not all of those patterns followed the same outcome you remember. Every major choice you made, every time you said yes, every time you walked away, every time you stayed when you could have left, created a direction. You experienced one path. But the emotional energy around that choice didn't simply disappear. It organized itself around different possibilities. Your awareness followed one storyline, but that doesn't necessarily mean the others became irrelevant. So when something surfaces out of nowhere, it may not be coming from behind you. It may be brushing against you from the side. This is why the emotional intensity can feel so confusing. If it were just memory, it would feel faded, like an old photograph. But it doesn't. It feels sharp, immediate, sometimes even overwhelming. That's because what you're sensing isn't just information. It's active emotion still carrying charge. Your brain, trying to make sense of this, does what it always does. It searches for a matching image, a familiar scene, something it can label and contain. It pulls from your past because that's the closest reference it has. It says, this must be from that moment. And for a second, that explanation feels satisfying. But it's incomplete, because the image is only a translation, a way for your mind to give form to something it doesn't fully understand. The real source of the feeling may not belong to that exact moment you're remembering. It may be connected to a version of events that didn't unfold the way your current life did, and that's where things start to shift. If time isn't strictly linear, then your experience isn't limited to a single, closed timeline. It becomes something more dynamic, more interconnected. Moments are not just points on a line. They're like coordinates in a field that can interact under certain conditions. And those conditions seem to become more accessible when your awareness changes. When you slow down, when you become more sensitive, when you stop constantly filling your attention with noise, that's when these collisions happen more clearly. But here's where most people, unknowingly, make things harder for themselves. The moment this contact happens, they react from the old model of time. They assume something is wrong. They try to push it away, explain it quickly, or control it, and that reaction creates tension. Because instead of allowing the contact to resolve naturally, they resist it. They treat it like an intruder instead of a signal, and in doing that, they lock the experience in place, preventing it from completing whatever process it was initiating. So the real issue isn't the memory itself, it's how you meet it. And if two versions of reality can touch, even briefly, then the way you respond in this moment matters more than you think. This is exactly where most people make a critical mistake. When these memories arise, the instinct is to block them, ignore them, or force positive thinking to push them away. Doing this creates intense energetic friction. Instead of healing, you seal that disturbed energy into a cycle that will repeat itself even stronger. There is a simple and precise way to disarm this, and we'll get there in a moment. But first, you need to understand where this image comes from. When something uncomfortable appears in your awareness, your system immediately looks for safety. And for most people, safety has been conditioned to mean control. If you can control what you feel, you believe you can protect yourself from being overwhelmed. So the reaction becomes automatic. Tighten, suppress, replace. You tell yourself to think about something else. You reach for your phone. You distract your attention. Or you try to override the feeling with something more acceptable, like gratitude or logic. On the surface, this seems mature, even healthy. It feels like you're taking responsibility for your state. But underneath, something else is happening. The emotion that surfaced doesn't disappear just because you stopped looking at it. It doesn't dissolve because you replaced it with a better thought. It remains active, like a signal that was interrupted but never completed. And because it wasn't allowed to move through your awareness, it stays suspended, holding energy. You can feel the result of this, even if you don't connect it directly. A subtle heaviness that follows you through the day. A mental fatigue that doesn't match your actual effort. A sense that something is unresolved, even when nothing is visibly wrong. This is the cost of resistance. It's not dramatic. It doesn't always show up as a breakdown. It's quieter than that. It drains you slowly, through small leaks in your attention and energy. And the more often you repeat this pattern, feel, resist, suppress, the more sensitive the system becomes. The next time the memory appears, it carries more pressure, because it's not just the original signal anymore. It's the accumulation of everything that was never fully processed. And this is where confusion grows, because now it really does feel like something is wrong with you. The intensity increases, the frequency increases, and your sense of control decreases. So you double down on the same strategy. More avoidance, more mental control, more effort to fix what's happening. But the harder you push, the more tension you create. There's a reason for this, and it's very simple once you see it. You're treating the experience as if it were an error, when in reality it's a process. Something is trying to move, to complete a cycle, to resolve a charge. And your resistance interrupts that movement. It's like holding your breath without realizing it. At first it feels manageable, but over time the pressure builds, and your body will eventually force a release. Not because something went wrong, but because something natural was delayed. In the same way, these emotional signals don't need to be fixed, they need to be allowed. This doesn't mean you get lost in them or relive the entire story. That's another common misunderstanding. Allowing is not the same as indulging. It's not about feeding the emotion with more thoughts or amplifying it with interpretation. It's about not blocking it. There's a very specific difference between feeling something and fighting something. And most people have never been shown how to stay in that narrow space between the two. So what happens instead? The moment the feeling appears, the mind rushes in to explain it. It attaches meaning, builds a narrative, and pulls you deeper into a familiar storyline. Now you're no longer just feeling energy. You're inside a story about your past, your identity, your perceived failures. And that story locks the experience in place even more. Because now, instead of a moving signal, it becomes a fixed reality in your mind. This is why simply thinking differently doesn't solve it. The issue isn't the thought. The thought is a byproduct. The real movement is happening underneath, at a level that doesn't respond to force or logic in the way you expect. And until you see that clearly, you'll keep trying to solve this in the same way, getting the same result. But there's another layer here that most people never question. If the image in your mind is only a translation, if the feeling is active and present, then where is it actually coming from? Because the moment you stop fighting the signal, a different kind of curiosity becomes possible. Not the kind that analyzes, but the kind that observes without rushing to conclude. And that's where the origin of these experiences starts to reveal something much deeper than memory alone. Think about a major crossroads in your life. That painful breakup, that job rejection, or that move to another city. One version of you took path A, and your awareness moved forward. But path B also collapsed into a reality. That random memory is a signal. A parallel version of you in that other timeline is going through a deep crisis right now. This isn't about imagination or fantasy. It's about understanding how choice organizes experience. Every decision you've ever made didn't just create an outcome. It created a direction for your awareness. You continued along one path because that's where your attention stabilized. But the emotional charge around the other possibilities didn't simply vanish. It remained structured like an unfinished equation still holding weight. And that's where things begin to feel personal. Because when that memory shows up, it doesn't feel like you're observing something distant. It feels intimate, immediate, almost as if you're being pulled into a version of yourself that is still inside that moment, still trying to process something that never fully resolved. You might notice how specific these moments can be. It's not always the biggest events. Sometimes it's something subtle, a conversation that could have gone differently, a risk you didn't take, a moment you stayed silent when you wanted to speak. And yet when it returns, it carries a surprising emotional intensity, as if that small moment held more weight than you realized at the time. That's a clue. It suggests that what you're feeling isn't just tied to what happened, but to what remained open, to what continued unfolding somewhere beyond your direct awareness. Your mind tries to simplify this. It says, this is just regret, or this is just an old memory resurfacing. But that explanation doesn't fully match the experience. Because regret usually has a narrative. You can explain it, justify it, place it in context. What you're feeling here is different. It often arrives without a clear story, or with a story that feels incomplete. That's because the image you see is only a surface translation. The deeper layer is structural. Imagine your life not as a single line, but as a network of paths that continue to exist as patterns of possibility. Your awareness moves through one of them, but the others don't disappear. They remain as active configurations, and under certain conditions, especially when your attention becomes quieter or more open, you begin to sense those other configurations, not visually, not directly, but emotionally. Emotion becomes the bridge. That sudden wave you feel is like a signal crossing from one layer of your experience into another. And your system, trying to make sense of it, reaches for whatever image is closest. It reconstructs a memory, attaches it to something familiar, and presents it to you as if it belongs to your past. But the timing gives it away. The intensity gives it away. The fact that it appears without a clear trigger gives it away. Something is active. And if something is active, it means there is still movement happening within that structure. A version of you still navigating, still reacting, still holding tension. This can be uncomfortable to consider because it challenges the idea that your current life is the only place where things are happening. It suggests that your experience is part of something larger, something layered. But at the same time, it explains something that otherwise feels irrational. Why certain emotions return with such force, even when your present life seems stable. You're not randomly breaking down. You're registering something. And here's where it becomes even more interesting. The connection doesn't go just one way. It's not only that you sense those other versions, it's that your current state, your awareness, your stability, your ability to observe, also has an effect on that larger structure. Which means that when contact happens, it's not neutral. There's an exchange. And this raises a question that most people never think to ask. If different versions of your experience can touch, even briefly, what determines how often this happens? Why does it feel like these moments are becoming more frequent for some people, almost as if the distance between these layers is changing? Because if the structure is always there, but the contact is increasing, then something else must be shifting too. If you're wondering why this has been happening more frequently lately, the answer lies in your own expansion. As your vibrational field grows, the barriers separating your timelines become thinner. You've become sensitive enough to pick up the frequencies of your other existences. This doesn't mean something mystical suddenly switched on inside you. It's more grounded than that. Your attention has changed. The way you process experience has become less reactive, more aware. You pause more. You notice more. You're not as constantly absorbed in noise, distraction, or automatic thinking as you used to be, and that shift, as subtle as it seems, changes everything. Because sensitivity is not about becoming fragile, it's about becoming precise. Before, your awareness was dense. It moved quickly from one thing to another, labeling, reacting, solving. There wasn't much space for anything outside of immediate practical concerns. In that state, only the strongest signals could break through. Everything else stayed in the background, unnoticed. But now, there is more space. And in that space, you start to perceive things that were always there, just below the surface. Not as clear images or voices, but as impressions, emotional waves, sudden shifts in your internal state that don't match your external environment. This is where the veil begins to feel thinner. Not because something external is opening, but because your internal noise has reduced enough to detect subtler patterns. It's similar to walking into a quiet room after being in a loud place. At first, the silence feels almost overwhelming, but then you begin to notice faint sounds you would have never heard before. Your awareness is doing something similar now, and with that increased sensitivity, the boundaries between different layers of your experience become more permeable. What once felt separate, past and present, here and elsewhere, this version of you and another, no longer feels as distant. There is more overlap, more moments where something slips through. That's why these experiences can feel so unexpected. You're not trying to access anything. You're not forcing a memory or analyzing your past. It just appears, fully formed, with an emotional charge that demands attention, and because it happens without effort, it can feel intrusive. But it's not random. There's a kind of resonance involved. Just like two instruments tuned to the same frequency can vibrate together, different layers of your experience can align under certain conditions. And the more coherent your awareness becomes, meaning the less fragmented and reactive it is, the easier it is for that alignment to happen. Coherence creates connection. This is why people often notice these moments during quiet activities, washing dishes, driving, sitting alone. Times when the mind is not overloaded, when attention is steady but relaxed. In those moments, your system is more open, more receptive, and that openness allows contact. But here's something important to recognize. Increased sensitivity doesn't come with automatic understanding. You can feel more without knowing what you're feeling. You can perceive more without having a clear framework to interpret it. And that gap can create confusion, because part of you still wants to make it fit into the old model. It wants to label it as stress or memory or mood. It wants to reduce it to something familiar and manageable, and sometimes it succeeds, at least on the surface. But the deeper sense that something doesn't quite match remains. That's the tension between expansion and interpretation. You're experiencing more than your current mental models can fully explain, and instead of letting that uncertainty exist, the mind tries to close the gap quickly. It wants clarity, even if that clarity is incomplete. But if you stay with the raw experience just a little longer, without rushing to define it, something else becomes noticeable. The physical layer. Because these moments are not just emotional or mental, they show up in your body in very specific ways. A sudden tightness, a drop in energy, a pressure that wasn't there seconds before. And what makes it even more striking is that your external reality doesn't justify it. Nothing around you explains what you're feeling. Your life in that moment can be completely stable, and yet your body reacts as if something intense is happening. This is where the experience stops being abstract. It becomes tangible, measurable in your own system, and it raises a deeper question. If your current environment isn't creating this response, then what is? You know that sudden tightness in your chest that appears out of nowhere, with no apparent reason in your physical day. You look around, your life seems calm, but the anguish is intense and real. This is the material proof that you are acting as a consciousness lightning rod. You are energetically sustaining a version of your timeline where things didn't go so well. What makes this so disorienting is the mismatch. Your external world says one thing. Everything is fine, stable, under control. But your internal state tells a completely different story. And because you've been taught to trust what you can see and explain, you immediately turn inward and assume the problem is you. Something must be wrong with me. I thought I was okay. Why am I feeling this again? But what if this feeling isn't a personal failure or a hidden flaw? What if it's not even entirely yours? Stay with that for a moment, because your first instinct will be to reject it. The mind wants ownership. It wants clear boundaries. This is me, this is my past, this is my emotion. That structure feels safe. It creates a sense of control. But your direct experience doesn't always follow that structure. There are moments when what you feel exceeds your current life context. The intensity doesn't match your situation. The emotion arrives too quickly, too fully formed, without a clear chain of events leading to it. It's as if you stepped into a current that was already flowing. And instead of questioning the source, you question yourself. You try to trace it back. You search your recent interactions, your thoughts, your responsibilities. You scan your life for a reason that justifies the weight you're carrying in that moment. And when you can't find one, the discomfort grows, because now it feels both intense and unexplainable. This is where a subtle shift in perspective can release a lot of unnecessary pressure. Instead of asking, why am I feeling this, ask, does this fully belong to what I'm living right now? Not as a way to avoid responsibility, but as a way to refine your perception. Because if you look closely, you may notice something interesting. The feeling is real, but the context is missing. It's like hearing a powerful piece of music without knowing where it's coming from. You feel it in your body, but you can't locate the source in your immediate environment. And that's the key difference. When something originates from your present experience, it usually carries a clear thread. You can follow it. Even if it's complex, there's a connection between what's happening and what you feel. But here, that thread is either weak or completely absent, which suggests that the signal is entering your awareness from somewhere else. This doesn't make you passive or powerless. In fact, it points to the opposite. It suggests that your system is capable of registering more than just your immediate surroundings, that your awareness is not confined to a single layer of experience. But with that capacity comes responsibility, not to fix everything, but to recognize what you're engaging with. Because the moment you assume that every intense feeling is a reflection of your current life, you start trying to solve problems that don't exist in your present reality. You overanalyze, you create explanations, you adjust your behavior unnecessarily, and in doing that, you anchor the feeling more deeply into your identity. Now it's no longer just a passing wave, it becomes part of your story. I'm anxious. I'm not over this. I'm still affected. And that identification makes it harder to see the experience clearly. There's another way to meet it. When that wave hits, when the tightness appears, when the emotion rises without context, you don't immediately claim it as yours. You notice it, you feel it, but you also hold a small distance, just enough to observe without merging completely. Not detachment in a cold sense, but awareness with space. And in that space, something begins to change. The urgency softens slightly. The need to explain starts to loosen. You're no longer rushing to close the experience with a label or a conclusion. You're allowing it to exist without forcing it into a familiar box. And that's important because the moment you stop forcing a clear origin, you open the door to a different understanding, one that doesn't rely on your past as the only reference point. Because if this pain doesn't fully belong to your current moment, and if it doesn't behave like a simple memory, then the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly are you accessing when this happens? This is where everything you were taught about trauma collapses. You are not remembering the past. You are accessing and feeling the present of an alternative reality. The scene that appears in your mind is just your physical brain trying to translate an invisible frequency it doesn't understand, using an old image file stored in your mental hard drive. Your brain is a translator, not a creator of these signals. It receives something raw, an emotional charge, a shift in your internal state, and immediately tries to make sense of it using what it already knows. It searches for familiar images, past events, recognizable faces. It pulls something from your memory that carries a similar emotional tone and overlays it onto what you're feeling now. And that overlay is what you experience as a memory. But look closely at how it behaves. It often feels slightly off, either too intense for what actually happened or disconnected in strange ways. Sometimes the details are blurry, or the emotional reaction doesn't quite match the scene itself. That's because what you're seeing is not the source. It's a translation attempt. The real signal is underneath. Imagine hearing a sound in a language you don't speak. Your mind might try to associate it with something familiar, even if the match isn't perfect. That's exactly what your brain is doing here. It's taking something unknown and reshaping it into something known just so you can interact with it. This is useful, but it's also limiting, because the moment you believe the image is the origin, you start analyzing the wrong thing. You revisit the past, you rethink your choices, you question your reactions from years ago. You try to solve the memory, as if understanding it better will make the feeling go away. But the feeling isn't coming from there. So no matter how much you analyze, something remains unresolved. The loop continues because you're applying attention to the representation, not to the actual signal. This is the breakdown of the old model. You were taught that emotional pain is stored in the past, and that healing means revisiting, understanding, and reframing that past. And sometimes, that approach can bring partial relief. But it doesn't explain why certain feelings appear suddenly, without context, and carry a level of intensity that doesn't match your current life or even your actual history. It also doesn't explain why, even after deep reflection and closure, something can still return with the same force. Because what's returning isn't what you think it is. Once you begin to see that the image is just a surface layer, your relationship with these experiences starts to change. You stop taking the scene so literally. You stop assuming that every detail matters. Instead, your attention shifts to the quality of the feeling itself. What is the texture of it? Is it heavy, sharp, diffuse, constricted? Where do you feel it in your body? Does it move, or does it stay fixed? This kind of observation might seem simple, but it does something very important. It brings you closer to the actual signal without getting lost in the story your mind is building around it. And when you stay there, just for a few moments, you may notice that the feeling begins to shift on its own. Not because you forced it, not because you understood it, but because you stopped interfering with its movement. This is the part most people miss. They think clarity must come before release, that they need to figure it out first. But in experiences like this, clarity often comes after you allow the process to unfold without control. Your role is not to decode everything. It's to stay present enough to not distort what's happening, because the distortion is what creates the loop. The moment you attach the feeling to a fixed past event, you freeze it. You give it a boundary that doesn't actually belong to it, and now, every time that signal appears, it has to pass through that same filter, producing the same image, the same interpretation, the same reaction. It becomes predictable but not resolved, and over time that pattern can begin to bleed into other areas of your life. Not dramatically at first, but in subtle ways. Your energy shifts. Your decisions become slightly influenced by something you don't fully understand. You react to situations with a weight that doesn't entirely belong there. It's as if something unresolved is quietly shaping your present, and if that underlying signal continues to be misinterpreted and resisted, it doesn't just stay internal. It starts to express itself outward in ways that are harder to trace back to their origin. If you keep fighting these echoes, the problem leaves your mind and starts invading your physical world. The trauma from that parallel timeline begins to leak into your current reality. That's how you start manifesting financial blocks, chronic exhaustion, and conflicts that have no root in your present life, but are being imported from that unresolved frequency. At first, this doesn't look dramatic. It shows up in small distortions. You feel more tired than usual, even when you've rested. You lose focus more easily. Simple decisions feel heavier than they should. There's a subtle friction in your day, like something is slightly out of alignment, but you can't point to a clear cause. Then it starts to organize itself. You may notice patterns forming in areas that used to feel stable. Conversations become tense without a clear reason. Opportunities slip or stall. You hesitate where you would normally move forward. And the strangest part is that on the surface, nothing significant has changed in your external life to justify this shift. So your mind does what it always does. It tries to explain it using what's visible. It blames circumstances, other people, timing, even your own abilities. And sometimes those explanations seem to fit, at least partially. But there's always something missing, something that doesn't fully add up. Because the origin isn't entirely here. What's happening is more subtle. The unresolved signal you've been resisting internally starts to influence how you perceive and respond to your environment. Not in an obvious way, but through small adjustments in your state. Your patience shortens, your clarity weakens, your energy becomes inconsistent. And from that altered state, your actions begin to shift. You might avoid something you would normally face. You might react more strongly to something minor. You might withdraw, overthink, or delay without realizing why. And those small changes create real consequences in your physical world. This is how the leak happens. It's not that another reality is physically crossing into yours. It's that your internal alignment is being affected by something you haven't fully allowed or understood. And because your internal state shapes how you engage with life, the effects become visible through your behavior, your decisions, and your interactions. In other words, the signal becomes embodied. And once it reaches that level, it becomes much harder to trace it back to its origin. Now it looks like a life problem, a pattern, a situation you need to fix externally. So you focus more on managing outcomes, trying to control results, improve circumstances, solve visible issues. But the more you do that without addressing the underlying signal, the more exhausting it becomes, because you're working against something you haven't acknowledged yet. There's also a reinforcing loop that can form here. As these external issues appear, they create new emotional reactions, frustration, doubt, stress. And those reactions can resonate with the original signal, amplifying it even more. Now the cycle feeds itself. What started as a subtle internal experience becomes a layered pattern that feels real, complex, and difficult to break. And at that point, it's easy to believe that your life is simply becoming more complicated, more challenging, or even more limited. But that interpretation keeps you focused in the wrong direction, because the visible problems are not the root. They are expressions. If you trace them back carefully, you'll often find that they began shortly after those moments of unexplained emotional intensity. The ones you tried to ignore, suppress, or push away. The ones that didn't seem important enough to sit with. That's where the shift started. And this is not about blame, it's about precision. Seeing the connection clearly enough that you stop trying to solve everything at the surface level. Because once something reaches your physical reality, it demands more effort to manage. It requires time, energy, attention. But before it reaches that point, when it's still just a signal passing through your awareness, the way you meet it can completely change its trajectory. That's the turning point most people miss. They wait until something becomes a real-world problem before they take it seriously. But by then, the pattern has already taken form. It's already influencing outcomes. The real leverage exists earlier, in those quiet, uncomfortable moments that seem easy to dismiss. And if the way you respond in those moments can either allow the signal to resolve or push it into your lived reality, then the question becomes very direct. What would it look like to meet that signal in a way that doesn't create resistance at all? The ultimate solution is not to numb your mind. The secret is to act as an observer. When the memory appears out of nowhere, you don't fight it. You don't dive into the drama, and you don't try to understand it. You simply feel it and say to yourself, I see you, I feel you, and I release and integrate this timeline. By allowing the emotion to pass through you without resistance, you collapse the negative probability wave. This may sound almost too simple, especially after everything you've felt. Your instinct might be to ask, is that really enough? But the effectiveness of this approach doesn't come from complexity. It comes from precision, because what you are dealing with is not a problem to solve, but a process to complete. The moment the feeling arises, your first job is to notice the exact point where reaction would normally begin, that split second where the mind wants to label, control, or escape. Instead of following that Pravichnyi path, you pause, not forcefully, not rigidly, but just enough to stay present. You let the feeling be there, not as a story, not as a memory, but as a sensation moving through your body. It might feel like pressure, heat, tightness, or restlessness. Stay with that layer. The raw experience before the mind builds meaning around it. And this is where something subtle but powerful happens. When you don't resist, the energy doesn't get stuck. It begins to move. sometimes slowly, sometimes in waves, sometimes intensifying briefly before it softens. This movement is what was being interrupted before. This is the cycle completing itself. But the key is your position in relation to it. You are not inside the emotion being carried by it. You are aware of it, allowing it, without trying to change its direction. That's what it means to act as an observer, not detached but stable. The phrase you repeat internally is not magic. It's orientation. It reminds your system that you are recognizing the signal without merging with it. I see you acknowledges its presence. I feel you allows it to move through your body. I release and integrate removes resistance and closes the loop. And as simple as that sounds, your body understands it immediately. You may notice your breathing shift. Your shoulders drop slightly. The intensity begins to reorganize, not disappear instantly but lose its grip. The urgency fades, and what remains is a more neutral sensation, sometimes even a sense of quiet. That's the collapse. Not something dramatic, but a subtle resolution. The wave that was holding tension no longer needs to maintain its structure, because it has been fully received without interference. And here's something important to notice. You didn't have to understand where it came from. You didn't have to revisit the past. You didn't have to fix anything. You changed how you met it. That's what allowed the process to complete. At first, this may take conscious effort. You might catch yourself halfway through reacting. You might get pulled into the story before remembering to step back. That's normal. The pattern has been practiced for a long time, but even then, you can shift. Even in the middle of it, you can stop, return to the sensation, and allow it to move. Over time, something begins to change. The gap between the signal and your reaction becomes wider. You notice earlier. You stabilize faster. The intensity, while still real, becomes less overwhelming because you're no longer adding resistance to it. And with that, the frequency of these episodes can begin to shift as well. Not because you're avoiding them, but because you're no longer sustaining them. The system starts to trust that when something arises, it will be met properly. There's no need to amplify the signal to get your attention. There's no need to repeat it with more force. And this is where you begin to feel a different kind of control. Not control over what appears, but control over how it is processed. A quiet confidence. You no longer fear the sudden memory, the unexpected emotion, the unexplained shift, because you know exactly what to do when it arrives. You don't brace against it, you don't chase it, you meet it. And in meeting it this way, you stop the chain reaction that used to carry it into your thoughts, your identity, and eventually your life. But there's another effect that starts to emerge, something that goes beyond simply neutralizing the disturbance. Because when that energy is no longer tied up in holding unresolved patterns together, it doesn't just disappear. It becomes available again. The moment you perform this simple collapse, something immediate happens in your physical body. A sense of weight leaves your shoulders. By healing this fracture, the vital energy that was leaking to sustain that parallel reality returns to you in the present moment. Your mind clears, your focus returns, and you absorb only the wisdom of the experience without carrying the pain. It's subtle but unmistakable. You may notice it first in your breathing. It deepens without effort. The tight grip in your chest loosens, your jaw unclenches. It's as if your body had been holding something in place without you realizing it, and now it no longer needs to. That something was not just emotional, it was energetic attention. Before, part of your awareness was locked into sustaining a signal that never fully resolved. Like leaving a light on in a room you're not using, it was quietly draining you in the background. You could still function, still move through your day, but never with your full capacity available. Now that energy begins to return, and when it returns, it doesn't come back as intensity, it comes back as clarity. You think more directly. You feel less divided inside. Decisions that seemed complicated a few hours ago suddenly feel simple, almost obvious. Not because the situation changed, but because you are no longer processing it through interference. This is what real restoration feels like. Not excitement, not a sudden rush, but a clean, steady sense of presence. You're here again, fully. And with that presence comes a different relationship to your own mind. The noise reduces. The need to constantly figure things out softens. You're not chasing explanations or trying to fix invisible problems anymore. There's a quiet confidence in just seeing what is in front of you. What's interesting is that the original experience, the memory, the emotion, doesn't disappear as if it never existed, but it changes form. It loses its emotional charge and becomes something else. Information. You can still remember what happened or what appeared in your mind, but it no longer pulls you in. There's no weight attached to it. It's like looking at a photograph instead of being inside the scene. And in that shift, something valuable is extracted. Not a dramatic lesson, not a forced meaning, but a kind of natural understanding. You see patterns more clearly. You recognize what matters and what doesn't. You gain a kind of quiet intelligence that wasn't accessible when the emotion was active. This is the part most people overlook. They think healing is about getting rid of pain. But what actually happens is transformation. The energy that was tied up in that pain becomes available for awareness, for focus, for choice. And over time, this begins to accumulate. Each time you allow a signal to resolve, instead of resisting it, you recover a small amount of your own capacity, a bit more attention, a bit more stability, a bit more presence. It doesn't feel dramatic in the moment, but the effect builds. You become less reactive, less easily pulled into loops, more able to stay with what's real instead of what's projected. And that changes how you move through your life in very practical ways. You listen more clearly in conversations. You respond instead of reacting. You notice opportunities without overthinking them. You conserve energy because you're no longer leaking it into unresolved internal patterns. Even your body reflects this shift. There's less tension, less background stress. You don't carry the same invisible weight from one moment to the next. And perhaps most importantly, you start to trust your own experience again. Not because everything feels good all the time, but because you know how to meet what doesn't. You're no longer afraid of those sudden waves, those unexpected emotions, those moments that used to throw you off balance. They've become part of a process you understand through direct experience. And in that understanding, something stabilizes deeply within you. You're no longer scattered across different layers of unresolved experience. You're more gathered, more coherent. And that coherence has its own kind of gravity. It begins to organize your life in subtle ways. Not by force, not by control, but by alignment. The way you think, feel, and act starts to move in the same direction. There's less internal conflict, less hesitation, less noise interfering with your choices. You don't need to push as hard to create movement anymore, because your energy is no longer divided. And when your energy is no longer divided, your presence becomes stronger. Not louder, not more aggressive, but more precise. What you focus on holds. What you decide carries through. What you engage with receives your full attention. This is where things begin to shift, not just internally, but externally as well. Because the way you show up is no longer shaped by unresolved signals pulling you in different directions. It's shaped by a clear, stable center, and from that place, even the simplest actions start to have a different impact. These uncomfortable and random memories were never punishments or neurological failures. They are calls for help from other versions of you, and from where you are now, you hold the absolute power to heal all of them through simple, conscious observation. The next time a distant memory suddenly knocks on your door, remember, you are not a nostalgic victim. You are the master unifying your own multidimensional existence. If this resonates with what you've been experiencing lately, leave a comment sharing how these memories show up for you, and subscribe to continue expanding your consciousness. And to know you stayed all the way through, write this in the comments. I choose to observe, not resist. If this connected with you, watch one of the videos on your screen now.